Hey, welcome back. This is fine, right? Everything's fine. So today we're going to be looking at an elemental mod spam build, or the elemental Harbinger as I've nicknamed it. So primarily we're going to be using Firestorm with Enigma as kind of our backup here. The Chaos Driver is just amazing for anything that's really obnoxious for Firestorm to hit. In general overview, I'm going to go over why, first of all, Archon is not my primary archetype and is my secondary, and I actually chose Alchemist. So first thing is the total DR here is 72.2, and that's going to be up to 80% pretty much at all times while we're in a fight. Second thing is what our resistances are and will be once we get them totally set up. We're well above the default health threshold, and kind of some of our choices over here, what you have to choose from and what I personally chose to go with. I am going to preface this by saying that I am using the Stone of Malevolence, which is currently bugged, so if you have an issue with that, change it out, don't watch the video, it's up to you. So first of all, we have Alchemist as our primary archetype because one, the Elixir of Life can kind of give you a get out of jail free card. Archon is our secondary because we actually don't need the mod power to completely spam it. Now, if you put Archon as your primary, yes, you can get way more mod uses out. You could drop Ring of the Follower, you can drop Stone of Malevolence, go total mod damage, and you would get a lot more damage out of the build. But we're trying to be as tanky as possible at the same time and make it a well-rounded build so you can actually play it in Apocalypse difficulty or have some more fun with it and not be a glass cannon. So that's one of the main reasons here we're running damage reduction, armor, and mod cost. So mod cost is just to help subset not using Archon as the primary archetype, along with Burden of the Follower, and Stone of Malevolence, of course, helps generate more mod power. Talisman of the Sun, because as long as you're using Firestorm as your primary source of damage, the more elemental damage you deal and burning damage you deal, the more mod power you're going to get back from Stone of Malevolence. Now, let's say you're versing a boss that is very difficult to hit with Firestorms. Even if it's a flying enemy, if you directly hit them with the Firestorm, it will track them and follow them. But let's say you're having an issue doing that, you're not a huge fan of Firestorm for certain fights, and it just doesn't feel good, then you would use Enigma and you would switch over to different mods, or to a different amulet, such as the Golden Ribbon. Not a terrible choice. My personal favorite is Jester's Bell. It just increases all damage, so the damage that the Firestorm itself is doing, or for Enigma, if you were to use the Chaos Driver, you can only have 7 tethers. And anything more than that, if you're generating enough mod power with this build, you absolutely will. You can keep shooting the Chaos Driver, but you're not going to get more damage once you have 7 of them in the same target. So you can go back to the primary fire, and Jester's Bell is great because even though it's less damage for the mod itself compared to certain other things, it increases all damage. So if you go back to using the primary fire of Enigma, it's going to increase the damage of that as well. So you also have other options like Detonation Trigger if you were to use the Star Shot for the Big Bang, which is really fun, shooting giant nukes every once in a while. But it's pretty inconsistent, and especially if you max out your AoE, which I actually don't in this build. The larger your tornadoes are, the more of a black hole they become. And one of them is not too bad, but as soon as you start to stack them and you get more and more tornadoes in the same general vicinity, especially if they're tethered to an enemy, you can just suck yourself in and have no way to escape. Except for Havoc Form, which is why we take this. You can actually choose Chaos Gate for more damage, but then you're not going to be hitting that 80% DR. And Havoc Form is great because I'll show you guys later, if you have multiple stacked tornadoes to the point where your roll can't get out of it, even with using Bright Steel Ring, which we use because we're full ultra armor with Labyrinth Gloves to get as much armor as possible, and Bright Steel Ring helps if you have 1, 2, maybe even 3 tornadoes to get you out without using it. But if you have multiple stack tornadoes, you know, say you have 7 or 8 on the same target, which you can absolutely accomplish, Havoc form is pretty much the only thing that I've found that will actually get you out. So you're going to start taking a lot of damage, because even when you stack your fire resistance up and your 80% DR, it's not the burn that kills you when you get sucked into your own black hole. It's the constant tick damage of the firestorms themselves doing damage, along with the burning damage, because the burning damage can't stack, right? It lasts up to 10 seconds and can't stack multiple burns at the same time. So what's going to kill you is the tick damage of the firestorm itself. So once there's too many firestorms, if you don't have a way to get out of it, you're just going to perish. So you can see here we have 72.2% total DR. If you put a singular tornado down, one of the accessories that we run here is the hardcore metal band. And every time you take damage, not even from an enemy, just in general take damage, you get a stack of bulwark. And you can see we're at 5. It fluctuates between 5 and 4. I'm not sure if the damage doesn't tick correctly on yourself, what exactly happens there. But you can see we're right around 79-80% DR. So once we're at that 80% DR there, that is because of our concoctions. We're currently running, and this is the main reason up here that we're running Alchemist, because we want to be as tanky as possible. So we're running 30 armor, 25 max HP, additional health regen, and I would strongly recommend, if you invest in any form of regen, it's regular health regen, because if you take damage from your own tornadoes, you're going to get hit by that tick damage so often you're never going to keep that gray health. So regular regen is going to be much more valuable than gray health regen, because you're not going to keep that gray health long enough for the regen to matter. And then finally, the bottled shadeberry for the extra mod power generation. Again, we're trying to fit things in the build to supplement not using archon as the main archetype. So you can totally spam the ability as much as you want, even without running archon. The only downside is we have to supplement certain pieces of gear that might give us more damage if archon was our primary archetype, but then we wouldn't be able to get nearly as tanky. The exception to this is using the Alchemist concoction bug that I've showcased in prior videos. If you want to go watch that, I have 2 videos that showcase that interaction, but I'm trying to use as little exploits as possible, because they're not going to stay around forever, and not everyone is a fan of doing that. You can see here we got to 80% DR. So here you can see this is Vash Kawai's damage reduction calculator, and I'll put a link down to his channel in the description. And he's done a lot of really in-depth min-maxing and calculations on how to get to certain thresholds, not just for damage reduction, for all sorts of things. He's also done quite a few really cool build guides. So if you want to check his channel out, definitely go over there. But here you can see with 412.5 armor, which is what we have, 10% from Barkskin, 5% from the Relic, and then 5 stacks of Bulwark from the Ring, we're at 80% DR. We're not Summoner, so we don't get Blood Bond, and we're a mod build, so we don't use. So we get 775 total effective HP. So that's going to be the maximum damage you can take in one hit if you're full HP and you have all 5 stacks of Bulwark up. That's not always going to be the case, especially if you're taking tick damage from the fire, etc., if you got sucked into your own black hole. But this is relatively what you can look to take as a maximum hit. Nowhere close to the tankiest build in the game, especially if we were to use Song of Aether, Blood Bond, and we could even boost our HP up more by using different rings, but then we're playing a different build, right? So this is where we're at 775. So that's the tankiness of the build. And you have Tranquil Heart to get that passive health regeneration. If you use your heart, you double it. And doubling all regeneration works in tandem with Elixir of Life really nicely, because 10 HP per second is a lot. So you can, of course, change any piece of the build up that you want. This is going to be showcasing what I'm using here. So the only two options that I see that are decent for running the mod are Black Maw and Chicago Typewriter. So the main thing that you're going to be looking at when you choose between these two weapons is the flat damage that it does per hit and the rounds per second. And with that, you can calculate how much mod power you're going to get per second with your primary fire. So some people are going to like the typewriter better because the magazine is much larger. You're not going to have to reload as often, and especially in a build that has absolutely zero reload speed built into it. The typewriter definitely suits some people better. For me, however, I like the Black Maw AR-47 just a little bit better because if you pull up the calculator here, which I will do, you can actually calculate how much mod power you're going to get per second. And I'm not sure if this is a 1-to-1 ratio, so don't completely quote me on this, but still relative between the two weapons, you can see which one is going to generate more mod power here. So we can take 51 damage times 7.3 rounds per second. So you get 372.3 mod power per second. You compare that to the Chicago Typewriter. 30 times 11 is 330. Put it in the calculator in case you don't believe my math. 330. So you can see the Black Maw actually generates more mod power per second relative to the Chicago Typewriter. You're going to have to reload more often, but the goal isn't to have to use the primary fire to generate the mod power. You're going to see when we go to the target dummy test that you don't really need to do that except for a tiny bit at the beginning for kind of the ramp up. Over onto the jewelry here, if you're using the flame tornadoes for clearing, I would pretty much solely use Talisman of the Sun. The tornado is going to do 20% more damage, and the burn from it's going to do 50% more. So that's a lot more damage for Stone of Malevolence here to generate more mod power. Detonation trigger you would pretty much only ever use if you were going to use the star shot here, because it makes the primary fire and the big bang apply a burn. And that status ailment that it does is going to help Stone of Malevolence give you more mod power back. The golden ribbon again is a decent option, but you don't really have much use for the haste. You're not concerned about the fire rate. We run Burden of the Follower, so you would just be mitigating this anyway, not even fully, just a little bit. And there's not much point in this build for haste. So you would get 5% more mod damage than using Jester's Bell. But Jester's Bell is the secondary option that I switch to if I'm going to be using the Enigma primarily for a boss. Because the mod and skill casting speed is nice, but not mandatory. You already get 50% from Flashcaster, which is the Archon archetype trait. And there's not much point to stacking more of it. However, the casting a mod or skill increases all damage by 20%. Again, that's 5% less than Golden Ribbon, but it's also going to apply for the primary fire of Enigma or Black Maw, whichever one you're switching back to. Lemire Sensor is pretty funny. You can definitely still maintain your mods because the ramp up is going to be a little bit longer. Your mods are going to take a little bit more to cast each time, but each tornado is going to last 1.5 times as long. So your cap end of the ramp, when you have more and more tornadoes going out, is going to be higher. But there's not too much point to that. You don't gain any inherent damage except for the damage of the tornado itself, and maybe in some scenarios if you were to calculate the total damage that you're dealing to one target, the Lemire Sensor would be better, but I personally prefer the damage from Talisman of the Sun or Jester's Bell. And the 50% burning damage is definitely not to be underestimated. There's a few other options, but I don't really consider them. Chains of Amplification just gives you 20% damage to anything suffering from a status effect, but that does the same amount of damage as Talisman of the Sun without the burning damage, and Jester's Bell without the other upside. If you don't have the other options, Chains of Amplification works pretty well, but definitely not the best choice. And then the last one is One True King Sigil. Increase mod damage by 20%. So again, same as Jester's Bell, 5% less than Golden Ribbon, and enhances the effect of Farron's Sigil and Phelan's Sigil by 50% per sigil equipped. However, for this build, Phelan's Sigil, we're not doing melee damage, so this is completely out of the question. If you were to wear this, it's a complete waste of a ring slot. And Farron's Sigil, Works decently for the Enigma if you hit weak spot with it, but the flame tornadoes can't hit weak spot from what I've seen. And only the damage of the tornado itself can crit. The burning damage can never crit. So neither of these rings are great choices. They're pretty situational, and it kind of just makes the one True King sigil obsolete, I guess, because you have better options. Onto the rings here, we're wearing Bright Steel Ring to primarily, again, get you out of those tornadoes if you get sucked in. Also to dodge one-hit mechanics. Just because we're tanky doesn't mean we're trying to just face tank everything in the game. You would probably need a tankier build than this to do that on Apocalypse. You're going to be looking at running Summoner with 80% non-conditional DR and maybe Medic for more healing, etc. Definitely not tanky enough to just face tank everything in the game, but tanky enough to take a hit every once in a while, especially with a pretty decent recovery with Tranquil Heart and Elixir of Life. You can switch this out for Ring of Omens, then your evades are going to cost you more health, and if the goal is to get out of the tornadoes that you're getting sucked into, you might not already be 100%, and then you have to evade multiple times to get out of that tornado. You're going to be looking at, maybe getting to 50% as by the time you get out of that tornado. Not to mention that gray health is just going to get truncated immediately because you're taking that ticking fire damage or the damage from the tornado itself. So it's likely that Ring of Omens, while you're using this build, just says evades cost 14% max health, and you're not going to get it back as gray health. Not to mention, as we mentioned earlier in the video, we don't invest in gray health regen, so the only benefit of it being gray health compared to just missing health in general is 0.2 gray health per second. So that's pretty negligible. The second ring we have here is the Hardcore Metal Band, and I showed that earlier where if you take the ticking damage from the fire tornado, you can purposely put one of them under your feet to give you 5 stacks of bulwark at all time, as well as just taking generic damage from enemies. That's how we get to that 80%. There's not really any better way to get enough DR to get your total DR up to 80% reliably, or non-conditionally, I should say. You can get pretty close using some of the other rings like the 5% flat DR, but that doesn't get you nearly as much. So if you're looking to get all the way to that 80% threshold, Hardcore Metal Band is definitely the best one I've found for this build. Burden of the Follower is 50% mod generation. That's about it. The fire rate doesn't really affect the build too much. If you're primarily using Enigma, it is going to cut down the primary fire DPS that you're doing by 15% because fire rate's a multiplicative scaler, but we don't scale the primary fire of anything that we do in any way. No range damage, no range crit damage, except for maybe generic damage that we get from Alchemist here, 25%. So not really a downside for this build. And 50% mod power generation is half of what Archon gives you if it's your primary archetype. And then Stone of Malevolence, because it just generates an insane amount of mod power. In all honesty, in the current way that I have this build built, Stone of Malevolence is kind of the thing that ties everything together. It's the main reason why Archon doesn't have to be the primary archetype. Again, if you wanted to forgo some of the tankiness of the build, you could put Archon as the primary, maybe run Summoner, but your summons are going to have a tough time with the tornado. It's mitigated a bit by Kinship, which is one of the traits, but you could switch out some of these rings for more damage. So onto the traits here, we get Potency and Flashcaster as our archetype traits. We get those for free. We're trying to be as tanky as possible, so both Fortify and Barkskin have all 10 points in them to boost our DR as high as possible. We want to have Inherent Regen to counteract the burning that we're going to inflict on ourselves quite often, and we don't have those maxed out because there are a lot of other traits that we're trying to invest in here, so we get as many as we reasonably can. Spirit, more mod generation is good. Maxing out Vigor, all 10 points, because again, we're trying to be tanky. And this is the most personally controversial mod for this build in my opinion. I keep it somewhere around 4. A little bit of AoE size feels great on the build, but if you take it all the way to the level 10, the tornadoes are absolutely gigantic, and they really do just become black holes. You're going to get sucked in, you're not going to be able to leave, and that's it. Too much AoE really becomes a problem for this build. As fun as it might seem, especially I mean, this build is terrible for party play, but especially when you start maxing out amplitude, it really becomes a nightmare to try and play with anyone, even yourself. Your summons also just get sucked in, can't get out, and then die. A few other builds that I've played have a little bit of flexibility in the trait tree here, but for this build in particular, especially since our second archetype doesn't really have a beneficial archetype trait, we kind of lose 10 points in the trait tree by being an alchemist, but we gain so much from the concoctions that it's worth it. There's not too much flexibility here to change things around. You can take fitness. This is absolutely a viable option, but you're dropping tankiness pretty much, or mod generation. Kinship is almost mandatory to completely max out, because you're gonna again, the hardcore metal band is the way you get to that 80% DR. So taking 80% less damage from your own tornadoes on top of your resistance is really nice. And if you don't have this trait compared to completely maxing it, just test it for yourself. It is absolutely ridiculous how much damage the tornadoes can do to you, and they will kill you instantaneously if you don't have kinship on and you get sucked into multiple tornadoes. So not too much flexibility here if you're looking to run this particular build. If you wanted to invest more into Enigma as your primary weapon, then you could probably drop kinship, but the beams from Enigma, if you miss any of the shots and it creates a beam on the ground, can also hurt really bad when you're scaling mod damage. So I would just suggest taking kinship. It also helps with party play, just to make it a tiny bit better, especially if both you and the person you're playing with have kinship. They take almost no damage, and then they can survive the black holes that you create. That's about it for the traits. We can go over some of the other options you have for the rings. However, unless you're going to forego some of the tankiness that Alchemist gives you, or you're going to use the bug that I mentioned earlier, where you have multiple concoctions without using the archetype, the Alchemist archetype, you're going to have a hard time getting rid of these rings and making the build still feel good. However, if you change Archon to the primary, you can drop Burden of the Follower. You can probably drop Stone of Malevolence, although I wouldn't quite recommend it. And you can increase your damage with additive damage multipliers. The only multiplicative damage that you're going to get for this build is going to be crit scaling, which is really bad, weak spot scaling specifically for Enigma, and getting more mods out. So the more mods you throw out, the more damage you deal. It's basically like rate of fire for your mods. So the only multiplicative damage multiplier for this build is going to be mod generation. So here I have compiled a list of all of the rings that I think have any place in this build, and all of these are going to be reliant on what you're doing. The Singed Ring, at least versus the target dummies, doesn't give you a damage increase versus an enemy. Even still, there's not really room for the Singed Ring at any time. Increasing all damage by 10% is just worse than a lot of other ones, like Shard Banded Ring, or getting more mod power in general. Burden of the Warlock is going to give you a lot more mod power, but again, you're very unlikely to keep that gray health in this build. So let's go over them in the order that they appear here. We have Alumni Ring, just generic 10% elemental damage. This is going to help Stone of Malevolence generate more mod power. It's going to help deal 10% more damage, and that's about it. Pretty simple ring. Burden of the Destroyer, 15% more damage for everything. This is a really good option. This is one of the best options if you're going for just straight damage, because you don't care about the ideal range of the firearms unless you're versus a boss that really requires you to use Enigma, and then you might want to supplement this for something else. But if you're just looking for damage, especially for the mods alone, Burden of the Destroyer is great. Burden of the Mariner. The skills are basically your get out of jail free cards. They're not mandatory for the damage of the build or for movement or anything like that. So both of the skills here are primarily used for getting yourself out or living through getting sucked into one of your own black holes that you create. So the downside of the ring is not too bad. However, the upside is pretty decent, especially if both of them are on cooldown. But if both of your skills are on cooldown, throwing more tornadoes is just going to make it more likely for you to get sucked back in. So you really do have to be careful with this build. Burden of the Warlock is going to reduce your mod power requirement by 15% and cost you 15% health. Like we said before, especially if you're relying on the hardcore metal band to give you those 5 stacks of bulwark, you're not going to keep that gray health, so you might as well just say truncate 15% of your health every time you shoot a tornado. I wouldn't really use this. The upside doesn't warrant the downside. You're going to kill yourself very quickly, especially if you try to pull out the Enigma. You're going to delete your health very fast. Cataloger's Jewel feels very nice, but it's completely unnecessary for the build, especially without Archon being the primary and getting total mod power generation scalars. We're at 76% right now, so this 8 would turn into 14. That's pretty decent. However, your mod cost for Firestorm is 900 even after having a 25% less multiplier on it. It's going to take you quite a while just to get value out of that, whereas you could just shoot your primary weapon to get the mod power back if for some reason you aren't generating a chain by dealing damage with the mod itself. I wouldn't recommend using it. You can, but it's definitely not the best choice. Encrypted Ring is interesting for generic tankiness, however it's not very good. I wish it stacked 3 times on itself for the total regen instead of just increasing the duration, because in its current state it's not very good whatsoever. Using a mod regenerates 10% of max health over 10 seconds does not mean you generate 10% every second. It means every 1 second you generate 1 HP or 1% HP. So with 155 health, using a mod would give us 1.55 regen every second. Not very good, definitely not worth a ring slot. We already went over these 2 rings. Neither of them are really applicable in this build, with the exception of Farron Sigil, but it's very conditional, so I wouldn't really use it. Firestone is fine. It's 10% fire damage and 15% fire res, but if we actually just reconsume our consumables here, because every time you die your resistance is reset, Alchemist gives you a bonus every time you drink a concoction or any type of consumable, so you're going to have really decent resistances until you die, until you die and it resets on you. So we're going to put on the exact same ones we already have. I don't know why that didn't refresh it. Sometimes I get that bug, it's really weird. Anyway, these should be 10 higher. So you're at 72 fire res. You can see all of this is the primary important one because that's the damage you're going to be dealing to yourself. And 80 resistance is the highest that you can go in the game before it just truncates any additional damage reduction. So 80 resistance is going to give you 66.6% resistance to fire damage, and that's on top of the 80% damage reduction you have here. Getting anything over 80 fire res is completely pointless. That's why we don't drop armor here for the Crown of the Red Prince or anything like that. If you could stack it even higher, I would test that out, but with 80 fire resistance being the total cap, even like right now when it's bugged out, if you don't want to deal with fixing that, you can just eat a mud rub, and for 20 minutes you're well over the cap. So enough about the theory crafting and talking about the reasoning behind every piece of gear that we use in the build. Let's actually see what it does versus the target dummies first, and then I'll show you what it does versus certain bosses and enemies. So to begin with, we're going to be using it against just one target dummy so that you don't get some sort of skewed idea right off the bat because I'm hitting targets that can't die, which is going to skew the mod power generation, etc. So I'm going to show it against one enemy first, and you'll get a really good idea for what the actual mod power generation is going to be. Keep in mind it's going to be less if the enemy dies, etc. But this is, a good baseline. You can also, before I do the test here, you can also substitute this heart into the build. You're just going to be a lot less tanky. However, if you are having issues generating mod power for some reason, keep in mind you can just use your primary fire to do so, but the reprocess heart is great at giving a ton of mod power. Alright, good. So we're hitting just one enemy here. You can see that as we stand in it, we start to get those bulwark stacks. With only 2 flame tornadoes on the ground, you can see how fast that mod starts to regen, and that's just versus one target. And the more tornadoes you have on the ground, the faster it goes. You can even make it much faster And it gets to a point where there's basically no point to do anything except for spam tornadoes. And if you hit an enemy with it, it doesn't work on the target dummies. Oh, this is a good test here. You can see we're stuck in the tornado. The only way to get out is to use Havoc form there. And now once you're in Havoc form, you don't have a lot of elemental damage built into the build, right? You have a lot of mod power generation. So the best way to get out of Havoc form is just hold right click. Uses a ton of the duration very, very quickly. So that was the mod power test versus a single enemy, and a good showcase in how Havoc form can really save your bacon when you get sucked in. It's really hard for me to show on video how stuck I really was there. You can't roll out. It's absolutely impossible. I've tried it with Ring of Omens. We currently have light roll, right? So to be clear, if you want, you can take off the bright steel ring. You don't have to have it in the build if you don't mind the flops, or you'd like to invest a little bit into reducing your encumbrance, maybe wearing slightly less armor. This is the way that I like to play the build. Tailor it to your own personal play style. This is kind of the template for you to work off of and make it exactly how you like. So now we're going to show you something that is absolutely hilarious. Hard to replicate, but can definitely be done in the right scenario. Just tornadoes everywhere. This is fine, right? Everything's fine. So, again, it's going to be hard to replicate that in an actual fighting scenario with dodging mechanics, especially versus bosses, etc. But that's kind of what you can expect if you're versing a lot of elites, like the Red Throne area has a lot of elites, and you can absolutely stack up multiple tornadoes. And we'll even show you the damage here, because I know I haven't done that yet. And at first glance, you might think that the DPS isn't very high, and you'd be absolutely correct. This is not supposed to be the highest DPS build in the game. It's supposed to be a fun elemental build that can clear every difficulty in the game because of how tanky you are with the correct play, etc. But it's not meant to be the strongest build in the game. If you like spamming your mods, if you like having fun, you can use different mods with this too. Like I said, the Big Bang is also really fun, especially once you get a big stack of tornadoes going like this. You can stop throwing tornadoes, maybe wear the Lemire sensor, and just spam out that ability over and over again. Let's reset the counter here. So, you know, on an unrealistic ramp, we're at like 2000 DPS, and that's including the burn. So it's not insane, and I definitely would recommend using pipe bombs even, because the bleed from it is just also good damage. It doesn't work on the target dummies, but there's a lot of ways to supplement the build. There's a lot of things that you can change. If you don't care about getting to that 80%, you can change the hardcore metal band. If you don't care about the light roll, these are two ring slots that are super easy to change out for more damage. If you want to be less tanky, drop Alchemist, drop some of these concoctions, run Archon as the primary, get way more mod power generation. Lots of things you can do here. If you want to make it absolutely insane, max out Amplitude, but you're probably going to pass away if you do that. So that's about it, guys. If you'd like to see a video where I verse a bunch of bosses, I don't have time to do that right now, but let me know and maybe I can record something. So have a good one. Until next time.